If you haven't already, I invite you to open your Bibles to the letter of 1 Corinthians. And today we're going to be starting in chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Since it's been a few weeks, I'll remind you that we are beginning a new section here of our study of 1 Corinthians. This is lesson number 10 in the overall class that we are doing, and we have just now finished the first major section of that letter. That first section comes in chapters 1 through 4, and by now, if you've been with us at all, any time over the last couple of months, then you know what these opening chapters are about. They are about the divisions that are happening in the Corinthian congregation in regard to favoritism over various teachers. Some like Paul better, some like Apollos better, some like Peter, and that's okay. It's okay to have your favorites among your teachers, just like you have your favorites in any number of other things, but it's not okay to divide the church based on that favoritism. And that apparently is what is happening. So Paul has been attempting to humble their pride here in these opening chapters. He's scolding them a little bit, but he is also helping them to see what is the nature, the true nature of those who are teachers of the word. And he's given us 4 metaphors, if you remember. They are like servants, they are like farmers, they are like builders, and then the final one that Paul gave us was one that was really kind of specific to him himself and their situation, and that is he is like a father to them. And they all have their own appropriate work to do, but they are all a small part of the greater work that God is accomplishing in the world. Well, now that he has got that out of the way, Paul is ready to move on to some other subjects that he knows need to be addressed here in the Corinthian congregation. And remember, there are 2 sources of information that are giving Paul what he needs in order to know what he needs to address. One is from a previous letter that Paul had written to them, and they had written back to him and said, hey, we would like some clarification on some things. And so, beginning in chapter 7, and pretty much going to the end of the letter, that's all going to come from these issues that they have wrote about that they need some clarification about. And that'll include subjects like marriage and divorce. It'll include about eating meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. It'll include the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, the resurrection. All those subjects will be included in that. But then the other source of his information about their needs comes from the household of Chloe. And we don't know who Chloe is or where she lives. She might live in Corinth, or she might live in Ephesus and have some people traveling to Corinth from her household. We don't know. But apparently whoever it is that comes from there has reported that not only do they have these divisions that are taking place in the congregation, but there are a couple other really strange things going on as well. And those strange things are going to be the subject of our next 2 chapters, which is going to be chapter 5 and chapter 6. And so what are these 2 subjects that we're going to be looking at? Well, 2 things in particular. Number 1, it has been reported to Paul from Chloe's household that there is a terrible instance of sexual immorality that is taking place in the church. And we will see here in just a moment, this is not just your run-of-the-mill sort of everyday occurrence of immorality or adultery. It is something a bit more outlandish, okay? And then second, there is also a report that there are even more conflicts that are happening in the church that I don't think probably have anything to do with the teachers that we were talking about earlier. But some people in the congregation are coming to such loggerheads with one another that they're actually taking each other to court. And they are suing one another in court. Can you imagine how unsettling it would be to be a member of a congregation where 2 of your members are suing each other in court? There'd be a great temptation to take sides and to get involved in that. And that's exactly what you have going on in Corinth. Are you beginning to get the impression, as I am, that we got a pretty smooth life here at Riverwalk compared to first century Corinth? I know we sometimes look with admiration back at the early church to look at their example and to emulate them, but there's not much to emulate going on in Corinth at this particular time. So Paul has his hands full, and it must be pretty frustrating to have spent 18 months with them, nurtured them, brought them up in the faith, and now hear about these terrible divisive struggles that are going on. But listen, we all know that's just life with people. People are messy. Church life is messy because it's a people business. And, we always used to have the saying, ministry would be great if it wasn't for the people. And, well, that's all ministry is just people, right? And so, yeah, if you're just doing book work, that's easy, right? But people are usually more complicated. So that brings us back to the question, and, it brings us back to the question, what is the issue that's going to be involved in our class today? And chapter 5 and verse 1 is going to tell us what that issue is. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that not even the pagans tolerate. Now, is that a loaded statement or what? A man is sleeping with his father's wife. That's the issue. Okay, what does Paul mean when he says a man is sleeping with his father's wife? Well, you'll be relieved to know, at least I think you'll be relieved to know, he's not talking about his mother. That is his biological flesh and blood mother. If that were the case, I'm pretty sure Paul would just say that, okay? What we're talking about here, I think, is his stepmother, okay? Now, we'll come back to this in further detail in a moment, but for the moment, just take in what is happening and let's anticipate for a moment what Paul is going to ask them to do. He's going to ask them to take up church discipline against the man who is committing this particular sin. Not the woman, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. But he is asking the church to take it up against the man. The overall subject today is going to be church discipline, and it is a very difficult subject. My guess is most of us have probably not been in congregations where that has ever been practiced, or if it has been practiced, it is very rare. And so an interesting question to kind of ponder as we begin class this morning is, why is it that it happens so rarely? Well, first of all, let me say that might actually be a sign of something healthy. The fact that it is rarely something that we jump to means, we're not anxious to do this. And you don't want to be in a congregation that's anxious to do this kind of thing. We don't want to go around snooping around in other people's life to find out if there's sin in their life. Guess what you're going to find if you go snooping around very much? There's sin in their life. But on the other hand, it may be true that there is such fear about this kind of practice that we've more or less just kind of decided somewhere in the back of our mind, we're not going to do that. Maybe we haven't made a conscious decision in that sort of way, but we sort of have this settled conviction, we're just not going to do that. Well, why have we made that conviction? Several reasons, I think. Number one, it's a terribly uncomfortable thing to do. It just really is. If you've ever had to confront someone who is caught in what I would call habitual sin, okay, it is a very hard thing to do. To sit in front of them, to look them in the eye, to prepare for the blowback that you know is going to come your way if you do this, that's a very hard thing to do. Second, most of us feel pretty intuitively we don't want to judge others because if they got to looking around too closely in our life, they might find something they could judge us for. And we don't want to be exposed, so we don't want to expose them, so we're just going to make a little quiet pact not to let any of this be known, all right? Third, we don't want the negative consequences that will likely come if we do this. If we confront someone with their sin, it's very likely you're going to make an enemy of that person. And most of us would just rather not have that trouble. We don't want enemies. We don't want anyone hating us. Fourth, we might be tempted to believe it's just none of my business. That's between God and them, and why should I get involved with that? God will work it out with them, and if not, they'll have to face the judgment on the final day, so we'll just leave it to the final day, right? And five, this might be the big one. We sometimes, I think, misunderstand Jesus' teaching to judge not lest you be judged. We think that means we should never judge someone in their circumstances. And yet, the very one who taught that in the first great discourse of the Gospel of Matthew, which was the Sermon on the Mount, is the same one who teaches in the fourth great discourse of the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 18, that you are to judge members who have fallen into known and habitual sin. That is, you don't go sneaking around and looking for it, but if it's known, you have to take care of it. Okay? Well, all of those things and more, I think, factor into why this is so difficult for us and why we would be a little reticent to ever put this into practice. But sometimes it just is necessary. And Paul feels like in this particular case that he's dealing with here in Corinth, it really is necessary. And so that's going to be our subject both this week and then the next time we come together, which will be 2 weeks from today, because next week's Easter, so we won't taint our Easter morning with with talks of this, okay? But we'll come back and have class 2 weeks from today. So that ought to be enough to kind of pique your curiosity about the subject today. And with all that in mind, let's pause and read our text for consideration. I'm going to read the whole chapter to you here this morning. But our study today is actually only going to take us through the end of verse 5. And then next week we'll come back and do verses 6 through 13. But if you will, read with me, and we'll begin looking at this together. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that not even the pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife, and you are proud. Now that is something to say, isn't it? Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this? For my part, even though I am not physically present, I am with you in spirit. And as one who is present with you in this way, I have already passed judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on the one who has been doing this. So when you are assembled, and I am with you in spirit, and the power of the Lord Jesus is present, hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Now that's where our class will end today, but I'm going to go ahead and read the rest of the chapter for you so that you have a sense of it. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know the little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you actually already are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral and also greedy and swindlers and idolaters. In that case, you'd have to leave the world. In other words, that's not possible. But now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy or an idolater or a slanderer or a drunkard or a swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? That's a good point there. We'll want to reflect on that when we get there. What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? The implication is it's none of your business. But are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside, but you expel the wicked person from among you. All right, so as we look at this chapter that I have before us here today, I've broken it down under 4 headings, which will kind of govern our class for the next 2 weeks, really. First, in verse 1 and the initial part of verse 2, you're going to have the report, that is the report of this sexual immorality. Then from the middle of 2 down to verse 5, you're going to have the response, how they are to respond to this sexual immorality. That'll be our class today. Then next week, you'll have verses 6 through 8, which is the reason, that is the reason why you respond the way you do. And then finally, in verses 9 through 13, you're going to have the remnant. And I'll explain a little further. I was looking for R words, so I'm stretching it a little bit, but you'll see why the remnant applies when we get there. But today we're going to cover the first two, that is the report and the response. So let's begin with the report, beginning in verse 1. We already know what the report is because we've already read it together here this morning. There is a report that there is a case of sexual immorality among them, but is it of a kind that not even the pagans tolerate? That's, again, a significant sentence. Any habitual sin should be a matter of shame to an individual or to a congregation, but it is especially true if it is a kind of sin that not even the pagans will participate in. And by pagans here, he means the greater Roman society that they live in. A man is sleeping with his father's wife. Now, we've already talked about this. We know this is his stepmother, not his real mother. That is at least of some relief. And yet, it is still a pretty sticky thing whenever you think about it. And you wouldn't think that there would be a lot of information that we could attain just from this one verse that tells us about the situation. But because of the way it's written, we can actually discern, I think, several things that are going on here in this particular situation. Number one, I think we can discern this is an ongoing relationship. Okay? Paul is not saying that this is something that did happen. He's not saying that it is something that used to happen. He's saying it's something that is happening. Okay, this is going on. Now, interestingly enough, Paul does not charge adultery here on top of the charge of sexual immorality. Those are two different words in the Greek, and they stand for two different things. Sexual immorality is from the Greek word porneia. It's where we get the word pornography, okay? And it just means any kind of sexual relationship that takes place out of the authorized relationship of a man and woman in marriage, okay? Adultery is a different thing. It involves sleeping with someone who is not your spouse, but who is married to someone else. So because adultery is not charged here, it's very likely, I think we can assume, that either this man's father is dead or that his father and stepmother are divorced. Okay? So I think that's one thing we can probably likely know about the situation. A second thing we can know is probably, and I'll emphasize probably, they're living together. I think this is an ongoing thing here. And this is not just a quiet tryst that's taking place out of the public eye. Everyone seems to know that it's happening. Everyone seems to be conscious that this is an ongoing relationship that is taking place. The third thing I think we can know is that the stepmom in this situation is not a Christian. Why would I say that?
I got that more as you read later on, saying we're not supposed to judge someone
Outside the church, yeah. Paul does not ask the Corinthians to take any kind of action against her, but only against the man, which indicates to me that she is probably not a part of the church, and therefore Paul thinks it's none of your business to judge her. She's not a part of our covenant community. Okay, so she has no responsibility to us. Okay. So again, you wouldn't think all that much could be known about this situation just from one verse, but when you begin looking at it, there's some things to know here that are kind of interesting in opening this up to us. But let's go back to this phrase for a moment, near the end of verse 1, that it is of a kind that not even the pagans tolerate. Now, when it comes to the biblical background of sexual sin, there's actually a very specific place in the Bible where most forms of sexual sin is prohibited. You can turn to it if you want, or I'm going to put it on the screen here, but the chapter that talks about this the most in the Old Testament is Leviticus chapter 18. And it does not spell out every sort of sexual situation there. I suppose it would be impossible to give every kind of situation because the imagination of man is incredible. But it will certainly cover most of the things, and it certainly includes what Paul mentions here. But before we read about the specific commandment, I want you to notice how Leviticus 18 begins And then I want you to notice how it ends. It's got two paragraphs that serve as bookends on the end of chapter 18, and I want you to notice how those bookends go. Here's verses 1 through 5. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow all my decrees. I am the Lord your God, so keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord." Okay? Skip down now to verse 24 and see how the chapter ends. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways. That is any of the ways that he's just mentioned, and I haven't read it to you, but all the ways in 18. Yep, sorry, thank you. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, and so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So these two statements kind of serve as brackets on the teaching of sexual immorality in Leviticus chapter 8. And he's telling them, I don't want you to do the things that the Egyptians were doing, the people you used to live among, and I don't want you to do the things that the Canaanites are doing, that is, the people I'm about to kick out of the land. Because one of the reasons God's kicking them out of the land is because of their perverse action, not only in sexual realm, but certainly in the sexual realm as well. Okay? Now, as for the specific command that Paul is addressing here in 1 Corinthians 5, here it is, Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 8. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife, that would dishonor your father. Again, that's not talking about blood mother, because he will actually talk about earlier in Leviticus 18 a sexual relationship with your blood mother. So we know here he's talking about the stepmother. Okay? So we see the command, and we see that the nations of Israel, or the nations surrounding Israel, used to practice these things. The Canaanites did these things. The Egyptians did these things. So why does Paul say it's a kind of sin that not even the pagans tolerate? Well, the pagans he's talking about in this instance are not Egyptian pagans or Canaanite pagans. He's talking about Roman pagans. And Romans actually had, I don't know if you know this or not, but they actually had pretty strict laws about adultery and sexual relationships, especially within the family. Okay? For all of their decadence that was a part of Roman society, they were actually pretty conservative when it came to their laws. Now, why? Well, in their mind, it was not just about the act of sex itself. For them, it was about, for the Roman mind, it was about the honor of the household, the integrity of the household. The father had the authority over his house. His authority was never to be dishonored. A man, it definitely favored the father, because a man could have a concubine or a mistress. A woman could not. That would be considered adultery in that particular situation. And you can better believe you cannot sleep with your father's wife, your stepmom. Why? Because that would dishonor your father, and it would bring chaos into the family. That's how the Romans thought about that. They also thought about it in the flip way. A father could not sleep with his stepdaughter because that would be an abuse of his fatherly authority, and once again it would bring chaos into the family. Okay? So while it is true that there were no specific laws about sleeping with your step-parent or your sibling, it was generally frowned upon in Roman society, and it would usually be tried under adultery laws if the person, of course, was still living. Okay? So that's why Paul can say it's a kind of sin that not even the pagans around you are doing. The Romans, for the most part, I'm sure it happened, okay, but for the most part, they did not participate in this kind of thing. But with all this background in mind, it does raise a question. Paul says in verse 2, and yet you are proud. why in the world would Christian people be proud of this kind of activity in their membership? Well, we don't know for sure because Paul doesn't expound upon it, but I think maybe we can venture a couple guesses here. One possibility is they may think this is a part of their Christian liberty. The Christian faith, of course, teaches we are no longer under the law. And so, all throughout history, including in our own time, there has always been this temptation for Christians to use the grace of God as an excuse to do what they want to do. Okay? But of course, the truth of the matter is, even though we're not under the law of Moses anymore, we're still called to live by the eternal character of God, which never changes. The civil laws we're no longer under in the law of Moses. The ritual laws we're no longer under from the law of Moses. But the moral law, it does not change, not because we're specifically under the law, but because God's character never changes. And so it's never, anything that was immoral in the past is still immoral today. It doesn't evolve in that particular way because it is a part of God's moral nature. So that's one possibility. They may have been proud, hey, this is part of Christian liberty, and we're just letting them do what they want to do. Okay? Here's a second possibility. They may have been proud of their own love, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is they may have felt like, hey, we're not being a judgmental people here. Yeah, it's true, people are going to make bad decisions and we hate that, but we're going to allow them to make their own mistakes, to figure their own way, and we're just going to love them through it. Okay? Indeed, I think that's one of the primary arguments that is given today for accepting various forms of sexuality in the church that the church historically has not accepted. And it's a hard thing to do because there's persuasion to that argument. There's the idea that, that we're asking people to do really hard things and we don't want to be judgmental if they fail at that. And we want them all to have fulfilling, loving relationships. And so perhaps that looks different for someone else than it does for me. But, and that becomes a very powerful persuasion for us. So those are the two options that kind of stand out there for me. When he says they're proud, I do not take it to mean they're flagrantly proud of the sin itself, as if that just doesn't seem to be in tune with the character of the rest of the letter. I think it's much more likely that they are either proud of their liberty or are proud of their, we're loving them through this and we're not going to tell them what to do kind of thing. That's kind of my guess. I'll open that up for a minute. Any comment or question about what you think some of that may be about in that regard? Anything else occur to you?
Sometimes I think that it's, like you're allowing that person to continue to serve in the role that they were. So like if this person would have been a preacher or a deacon or something like that, that they're not saying we're going to make him at least leave his position because we know he's living in sin. It's just like, oh, you just keep doing your thing.
You just keep doing your thing, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're proud of their own tolerance kind of thing, yeah. Anybody else? I don't blame you for not venturing into those waters. Those are shark-infested waters, those are. We want to stay away from that. All right, so this leads us in very nicely to the second major heading, and that is, we've heard the report, we know what's going on now. How are they going to respond? How does Paul call them to respond? And we're going to see that Paul is going to call them to respond in a very particular sort of way. Middle of verse 2. Did I miss that verse? I must not have stuck that in there. Well, verse 2. Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning, Paul says, and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this? So here's how Paul thinks they should respond. Rather than being proud and putting up with the sexually immoral behavior, instead they should be mourning, and they should be putting the man out of their fellowship. Now, it is quite obvious to me that as Paul talks about putting this man out of the fellowship, he is referring back to the teaching of Jesus about how this sort of thing is to be handled in a congregation if it ever comes up. If you want to turn there in your Bibles, you can. It's going to be in Matthew chapter 18. I'll also have it on the screen here in just a minute. But let's look at that great text of where Jesus teaches about this subject. Matthew 18 is a great text. I'd actually like to do a sermon series on Matthew 18 one day and just cover this one chapter because there's kind of a neat theme that works through it. If you know anything at all about the Gospel of Matthew, you know that Matthew is written around 5 great discourses from Jesus. Okay, the Sermon on the Mount is the first one. There is one on the teaching of the parables. That's in Matthew 13. Matthew 24 has the great teaching about the end of time and all the parables that go along with it. But then here in Matthew chapter 18, you have the 4th great discourse of the book. And if you were to give it a title, I think you would call this discourse Jesus and His Little Ones. Okay? Now, when we speak of little ones, we usually think little ones like this, right? Physical little ones. We're thinking about children. But we're going to find out as you come to read the chapter that while he's going to use a child as the opening metaphor or picture, when he's talking about the little ones, he's actually talking about childlike believers, those who have a childlike faith. Okay? So the passage begins like this in Matthew 18. At that time, his disciples came to Jesus, and asked him, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" They ask this several times, don't they? And they never get the answer any time that they... And so he called a little child to them, and he placed the child among them. I like to think he just kind of pulls him up on his knee or something. And he says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So the passage does begin with a reference of a child, but it will go on to make the point that you can't enter heaven unless you enter it in a childlike way. And by childlike way, he doesn't mean immaturity. Okay, he means that you trust in Jesus in a way that a child tends to trust their parent or some adult if they haven't been abused in some way. Okay? Verse 6 goes on to say, "If anyone causes one of these little ones," and he's not talking about children now because he's going to qualify it, that is, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and drowned in the depths of the sea. So here we see who the little ones are for the rest of the chapter. They're the ones who believe in Jesus. Jesus calls his followers his little ones, his little childlike ones that trust in him to come into the kingdom. So the whole chapter revolves around this theme, and you could break it down like this. In verses 6 through 9, you have the fact that Jesus' followers need to be protected like children. In verses 10 through 14, you have that Jesus' followers need to be looked after like children. Then in verses 15 through 19, you have the fact that Jesus' followers need to be disciplined like children. That is, children sometimes go astray. And guess what? Children in the kingdom of God sometimes go astray. Now that's the context of Jesus' teaching on church discipline, and I hope it'll help you understand what he has to say here. Okay, so let's read it together, chapter 18 and verse 15. "If your brother or sister," that is your fellow little one, okay, "if your brother or sister sins, go out and point their fault to them just between the two of you. And if they listen to you, great, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they still refuse to listen, then tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector." All right, I would imagine most of us are familiar with this teaching, even if we may have rarely seen it put into practice. But Jesus is teaching here about how we deal with ongoing habitual sin in the church. This is not someone who's messed up one time and has asked for forgiveness. This is not someone who's left because they've decided they don't want to be a part of us. That's on them then. But here you have someone who is a part of the body, but they are committing habitual sin, and it's known, at least by someone. Okay? How do you handle that situation? First, you go to that person and you bring their sin before them. Doesn't matter who does this. Some have tried to say it has to be the one who was sinned against, but the text doesn't say that. Okay. As a matter of fact, the older manuscripts used to say if your brother or sister sins against you. That used to be, but they've now figured out the earliest manuscripts don't even have that. So it's just if your brother or sister sins. So it doesn't matter who it is that goes to them. It can be someone in the church, can be their brother or sister, can be the preacher, can be an elder, whatever. But someone who's close enough to them, hopefully, to make an impact. Okay. This is to be done in a gentle manner. Remember what Paul says in Galatians? Let those who are spiritual among you do this work, and do it in a gentle manner, because most of the time we know it's not going to go well. And it's a very awkward thing to do. But Jesus says it needs to be done for a brother or sister, okay? So you don't go with a haughty spirit. You don't go saying, I'm going to tell you something, you know. You just certainly don't go with an air of superiority as if I couldn't commit the same sin if I wasn't in your situation. You go as one sinner to another sinner in gentleness. If they are not willing to hear that one person who goes to them, then you take a few more people. Why do you think that's the next step?
Well, it still keeps it relatively private,
Yeah,
but then you have the witnesses to verify what has
taken place.
and who said what and how the situation went. But
Yep.
you still have the opportunity to keep it outside of a public domain and have that opportunity to get it rectified without it being blasted all over the church or community or whatever.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think you have sometimes one person can have it all wrong,
Right.
or have a grudge against that person.
Right.
Whatever, and just that referee or other person there that confirms it,
Yep.
you know,
Mhm.
then we're on solid ground.
Yeah, that's right. It can be very easy if one person brings something even if it's right, the other person could just dismiss and say, well, you either don't understand or you just got a grudge against me, but if you bring two or three, that's adding some weight. Okay. And it's a little bit harder to squirm out from underneath that.
But I think going along with what Jim just said, it also, it protects you from a witness standpoint, but it also maybe protects the one who you are confronting because of the accuser. Or,
Yes.
I don't mean the accuser,
Mm-hmm.
but the one who first comes.
Yeah.
So that you don't have a little bit of maybe a vendetta or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, because usually, if it's just one person, they're going to end up, whoever you're confronting is going to end up hating the one who, that can happen pretty easily. So then that doesn't work, let's say. Then you move to the next resort. You bring it before the church. Now, I don't think this means you have to get up and announce it in church, but I think it means you bring it before enough of the church so that the church themselves can then go to this person and beg for them to come and be restored. Again, not in a haughty spirit, not in a superiority kind of way, but as Paul says, with mourning, with hurt. Come back. We need you to come back, okay? Here you have the fullness of pressure. The whole church is now, or at least a significant portion of the church, is pleading with this person, give up your sin, right? And I want you to think about that. If a person has not given up by this point, that is when one person confronts them, or two or three confront them, or now the whole congregation confronts them, that shows they have a very stubborn and hard-hearted spirit. They're not going to give up their sin, okay? I'm going to do what I want to do, and you all mind your own business, okay? And Jesus says if it comes to that, then there's only one result, and that is you treat that person like a pagan or a tax collector. He doesn't mean by that you treat them poorly. He means you treat them like an outsider, that they're no longer a part of your community, that they are not among the saved brothers and sisters of Christ, okay? Not to be mean to them, not to be hostile to them, but you also don't treat them just like everything is okay, okay? Now, if you come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 2, you will hear Paul say again, shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning as you have put this person out of your fellowship? I think the mourning is key. I think all too often when this kind of thing is done, even though it's done pretty rarely, it can be done in a sort of confrontational, prideful spirit. And it needs to be evident that we're saddened by what is taking place and the difficulty that is happening, okay? Now, this raises a question for us. In this situation, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, why is Paul skipping some steps? You notice that? He's not asking them, go one person to him, go two or three people to them. He's moving right to the disfellowship. And I think it's because of what we've already mentioned here this morning. The whole church already knows. Okay, the whole church is aware of what is happening. And it's quite clear at this point that this man has no qualm about doing what he's doing. And so Paul says that's just simply got to change. And the result is you just need to put this man out of your fellowship. Now it's interesting to note what Paul goes on to say in verse 3. He says, for my part, even though I'm not physically present and I'm with you in spirit, I have already passed judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on the one who has been doing this. So Paul's saying basically, hey, it's a done deal in my mind. I've already passed judgment on the man. You just now need to step up and do the part that you're called to do, which, of course, is a very, very, very hard thing. Now, let's end class by looking at what Paul says in verse 5. Hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Here we see the purpose of the action of the disfellowshipping. They are turning the person over to Satan, hopefully temporarily, right? And they're doing it so that his flesh might be destroyed and spirit saved. Now, one might rightfully ask, how does this action potentially destroy the flesh? And by flesh, we mean not his body, but we mean his nature of being away from God. Okay. Two things, I think. First, three things. It helps the person caught in sin to see very clearly that they are in fact sinning. It's amazing. I don't know if this happens to you, but I'm sure it does because it happens to everyone. We very easily delude ourselves when it comes to our own sin. We can think of reasons and excuses and all these kinds of things, but whenever someone confronts it to your face and then brings it before you in a way you cannot ignore. Now, you may deny it or you may get angry or whatever, but at least you cannot ignore it. Second, the loss of fellowship in a church is a really serious thing. I think it was more serious in the ancient world because in most ancient cities you didn't have every church on every sort of corner who believed every sort of different thing. And so now a person can get disfellowship and they can hop up and go somewhere else, start anew, and nobody else will ever say anything to them, right? If that church is living in that kind of way. So it loses some of its sting in the modern world. But I still think it's true, unless you're a fringe member, if you're involved and you got a network of people around you in the church, as most people do, that is a close set of friends, when you lose that, and that's no longer available to you, that's a hard thing to bear, and it makes a person really think twice about the things that they are doing. And then third, and finally this morning, by handing them over to Satan, you're basically allowing them to do what you sometimes did with your children. That is, okay, you want to do that? You do it. See what the consequences are. And you let them face the consequences. And hopefully that won't take a real long time, but the truth is sometimes it takes a real long time. And people don't realize for many years the consequences of their actions, and sometimes will come back. But we always want them to know, you can certainly come back. You can certainly come back, but you must repent. You must turn away from your sin. Okay? So difficult text there, but we will come back then 2 weeks from today and learn more about the rest of this. We've seen the report, we've seen the response. When we get into chapter 5 and verse 5, we're going to begin to see the reason. Why is it that Paul says you cannot leave active habitual sin present among you? And his argument's basically going to be it spreads when you do that. Okay, you give carte blanche to others to do the same thing. And then he'll end the letter by talking about the remnant. That is, how do you live in a world where there's immorality and greed and idolatry everywhere? Well, you can't fix the whole world. Your responsibility is to the body of Christ. That's a different sort of scenario, and that's how he'll end the chapter. All right, well, God bless you all. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you on Easter morning.